Hello, everyone. Welcome to the British Library South Asia Seminar Series, which is part of our research and digitization project called 2 Centuries of Indian Print. Today, we are very happy to have Twisha Singh amongst us, who will be speaking on Arguing for a Feminine Space, People's Theatre in Calcutta, 1940 to 1960. Twisha is a doctoral researcher at the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill University in Canada. She is a graduate member of Canadian Historical Association and works as an editor of a journal of South Asian studies called HARF at her university. Her work focuses on theatre and performance studies in South Asia and modern Britain. She has previously completed masters in modern history from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. We are extremely delighted to have Professor Shubho Basu as our chair for this event. Professor Basu is an associate professor in the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill University in Canada. He's the author of Does Class Matter? Colonial Capital and Workers' Resistance in Bengal from 1890 to 1937, and Paradise Lost, State Failure in Nepal. Professor Basu has previously taught at Syracuse University, Illinois State University, SOAS London, and Cambridge University. He specializes in modern South Asian history and culture, labor history, nationalism, and post-colonial politics. About the structure of our session today, Twisha will be speaking to us for about 45-50 minutes, after which there'll be a short discussion between the chair and the speaker, after which we'll open it up for audience questions. If during the talk or during the discussion you would like to put in your questions, please use the chat box or the Q&A box to do so, and I will take all the questions in order during our Q&A session. So without much further ado, I welcome Twisha to speak to us today on Arguing for a Feminine Space, People's Theatre in Calcutta, 1940 to 1960. Over to you, Twisha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Priyanka Basu, for that kind and generous introduction. I would like to express my immense gratitude to the British Library South Asia Collection for hosting me in the pre-pandemic times of the year 2019 for my archival research work. I would also like to thank Professor Shubho Basu for joining us today. His feedback would be invaluable for me. Also, my other supervisor, Professor Elizabeth Elburn, will be joining us as an audience member, without whose support none of this would have been possible. And last but not the least, I would like to express my immense gratitude to the Department of History and Classical Studies, especially Professor Jason Opal and Professor Griet Vankerbergen, for supporting my studies throughout in the much trying and testing times of 2020 and 2021, and for their unflinching support. So without further ado, I will share my screen and begin the presentation. I hope the screen is now visible. So my presentation is broadly divided into two parts. The first half reflects the dominant social thought regarding actresses from the 19th century that shaped the debates and discussions in the later part of the 19th century and the 20th century. This part will also highlight the tense political climate of the 20th century to set the stage for the second part. The second part of my presentation will talk about Tripti Mitro and Reba Roy Chaudhary, reflecting on their nuanced personal experiences and the new gender paradigm in the realm of people's theatre that they became a considerable part of. So I want to begin this talk with a reflection on two short stories. One is Man Bhanjon by Rabindranath Tagore, and the other is The Actress by Munshi Premchand, as both of the short stories reflect the dominant social thought of the 19th century Calcutta regarding women in theatre. I would be reciting some lines in Bangla and then in Hindi. The translation is on screen, so nothing to be worried about. So beginning with my lines on Tagore. সেই সঙ্গীতের টানে লোক আভরণের ছোটায় এবং সম্মিলিত প্রশংসা ধ্বনিতে সেই ক্ষণকালের জন্যে সমাজ সংসার সমস্তই বিস্তৃতা হইয়া গেল। মনে করিল এমন এক জায়গায় আসিয়াছি যেখানে বন্ধন মুক্ত সৌন্দর্যপূর্ণ স্বাধীনতার কোনো বাধা মাত্র নেই। শুধু মাঝে মাঝে ভীত স্বরে কানে কানে বলে, বউ ঠাকুরন এইবার বাড়ি ফিরিয়া চলো, দাদা বাবু জানিতে পারিলে রক্ষা থাকিবে না। So this is from the perspective of the lead protagonist, Giribala. A French dramatist and theater director, Antonin Artaud, in his seminal text, The Theater and Its Double, which was published in the year 1938, suggests how theater has the power to cause thinking. Artaud was one of the strongest influences on theater in the 20th century and was of the view that theater goes beyond the banal values of relaxation and pleasure. A performer has a corporeal identity formed by his or her performance that defines the contours of creative labor. Artaud highlights that art does not function in a plastic way. Aptly portrayed through Giribala's character in Man Bhonjon, where Tagore's female protagonist, who is also the spectator of theater, is intoxicated by the metaphysical powers of the performances she witnesses to an extent that it provides an outlet from the mundane domestic goals of her day-to-day life. Being a grihini and a Thakur bow, respectable middle-class housewife, theater reflects her psychological conflicts and the daily realities of her life. However, the question of her interest in theater remains a moral one in the context of the then social realities. Tagore's short story aptly captures the sociological rift between respectable middle-class housewife, Giribala, and a theater actress whose name was Lobongo. This cleavage in social roles of both is personified through the character of Gopinath, who is Giribala's husband and later becomes Lobongo's lover. The story takes a crucial turn when Giribala's character wants to cross over the liminal space of respectability and become an actress. This transition is not only reflective of a movement from the domestic to the public sphere, but also from the higher grounds of morality to being associated with a profession that is strictly stigmatized and considered as immoral for women. The story is reflective of trials and tribulations of a housewife who wants to break away from the societal fetters she has been grappled with since her marriage to Gopinath and choose acting as her active vocation. The transition by the end of the story results in Giribala becoming a very popular actress, garnering love and fame even more than that of Lobongo. In another short story by Munshi Premchand called The Actress, which was written in the year 1927, almost 42 years later, we witness a reverse desire of the female protagonist, Tara Devi. This story was written at the time when the moral anxiety regarding women in theatre had already done rounds in public circle in Bengal. It is important to note that Premchand also became the president of the Progressive Writers Association, and in his presidential address, which I'm going to talk about later on, he reflects and hints on the formation of Indian People's Theatre Association in the year 1943. Now, I'm going to recite a few lines in Hindi, and the translation is on screen. जिस वक्त वह शकुंतला के रूप में राजा दुष्यंत के सम्मुख खड़ी ग्लानि, वेदना और तिरस्कार से उत्तेजित भावों को आग्नेय शब्दों में प्रकट कर रही थी, दर्शक वृंद शिष्टता के नियमों की उपेक्षा करके मंच की ओर उन्मत्तों की भांति दौड़ पड़े थे और तारा देवी का यशोगान करने लगे थे। कितने ही तो स्टेज पर चढ़ गए और तारा देवी के चरणों पर गिर पड़े। सारा स्टेज फूलों से पट गया, आभूषणों की वर्षा होने लगी। यदि उसी क्षण मेनका का विमान नीचे आकर उसे उड़ा न ले जाता तो कदाचित उस धक्कम धक्के पे 10-5 आदमियों की जान पर बनाती। मैनेजर ने तुरंत आकर दर्शकों को गुणग्राहकता का धन्यवाद दिया और वादा भी किया कि दूसरे दिन फिर वही तमाशा होगा। The last line, which literally translates, the manager immediately came and thanked the audience for the quality and the customer service and promised that the same spectacle would happen again the next day, is symbolic of the actress's corporeal identity through her labor that has enchanted her audience and is commensurate with the creative labor and talent she portrays while on stage. In the story, Tara Devi falls in love with an upper-class man whose name is Kuvar Nirmal Khan. When asked to marry him, Tara Devi is too skeptical as she considers herself as a tainted fallen woman who has been in the public eye for far too long. For her, it is not an easy transition to become a respectable housewife from the infamous performer she considers herself to be. These two short stories are reflective of a transition which is not necessarily teleological or easy. For Giribala, it was from the domestic to the public sphere, and for Tara Devi, it was a question of transition from the public to the domestic, which is nearly considered as impossible in Premchand's story. The reason why I wanted to highlight these stories is because it is reflective of the modern social thought during the 19th and the early 20th century regarding the profession of acting and moreover the actresses and the choices at their disposal. The social thought was imbued in a debate that peaked in the 19th century regarding the introduction of actresses in theatre. One of the prominent examples is when Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar severed his connection with theatre upon the induction of actresses despite being a prominent writer and a reformer. This diagram from Sudipto Chatterjee's very important book, The Colonial Stage, reflects the complex matrix of audience-theatre relationship in the 19th century. Coming to the second part of the first section, and talking about the much debated actress-prostitute connexion. One of the prominent reasons of this debate was the actress-prostitute connexion that lingered in the social circle for a very long time due to the public nature of the profession. But mostly because of the complex matrix of similarities and dissimilarities drawn between both the professions owing to the gendered lens that was being attuned to the female performer and her sexual identity. This was not the case when it came to the male actors and analyzing their creative labor and corporeal identity on stage. Rongaloy Borangona, which came in the journal Arya Darshan, was written by an anonymous author. In ancient texts, prostitutes were often referred to as Bornari or Borangona because of the source of her earnings would be performing arts. Borangona literally translates to public women, much different from the etymological evolution of the word prostitute. Even under the colonial state, prostitutes were a fluid category that involved dancers, musicians, singers, and actresses. It represented the complexity of the image of public woman or women in public sphere involved in performing arts. The depiction of a sexualized female form has been an integral part of Indian classical art. For example, yakshis, dancers, nayikas who are courtesans, or apsaras. Early criticism of sexualized images were counteracted by a post-independence justification that focused on their aesthetic value as well as their Indianness bestowed on them a spiritual and symbolic meaning. This anonymous essay, which was published in Arya Darshan in the year 1877, Rongaloy Borangona talks about this polemical connexion between the actress and the prostitute. The public and private debate regarding the profession of actresses has been to a large extent seen from this perspective. The symbolic meanings have deeper implications and roots that I'm not going to delve deeper into, as it should be attuned to a separate talk because it represents a separate discourse for analysis. However, I would like to highlight certain key points that underlines and are essential to trace the trajectory of social thought that got deeply imbued in the identification of actresses in the late 19th century. Firstly, the author says that conflation of actresses with prostitutes is not a modern phenomenon and has a classical precedent. In the essay, the author tries to focus on the sublime aspects of why the system of using prostitutes as actresses should not be considered as disrespectful or profane, as it has its roots in ancient history, even in mythology. Both the occupations involved higher performative strategies in case of courtesans, dancers, or actresses. The essay also discusses cross-dressing and transvestism in theatre. Transvestism was another area of moral anxiety where controlling, restricting, and maintaining homoerotic tendencies peaked. The author in the essay tries to draw an overall justification from the logic of mimetic realism that female roles should be authored by females. However, the underpinnings of this were deeply tethered to the abject fear of homoeroticism and homosexuality. The essay also draws a line between respectable women from domestic backgrounds and the tainted women like prostitutes who became an active participant through creative labor on stage. The author tries to suggest that this could be perceived as emancipatory for the prostitutes till a certain extent. During the 1870s, a major change occurred in Bengali cultural arena when some measures were taken up to recruit actresses from red light areas to perform in Bengali plays, as women from quote-unquote respectable families, Bhadra Mohilas, were not allowed to enter the public domain of men. Actresses like Binodini, Golab, Jagatarini, Elokeshi, Tinkuri, among others, left a lasting impact of their talent coming from similar backgrounds. The sexualized female form that is circumscribed within purity in classical Indian art was completely turned upside down with the influx of prostitutes. Professor Nandi Bhatia writes that the unavailability of middle-class women to perform in theaters and to financially sustain theater houses, many theater owners willingly accepted working-class women provided that they were quote-unquote reformed. Aryadarshan's essay also talks about reforming the fallen women who entered theaters to channel their creative labor in the field of art. This was contextualized in the background debates at that time that centered on education for women and improving their socio-economic identity. However, this was indeed an aspect of moral panic under the colonial state, as the induction of public women was considered to encourage immorality and intervened the logic of cordon sanitaire or clean spaces of the colonial state. These actresses, through becoming stage artists, did garner respectability to a certain degree on the outset. However, this led to an uneven development of a contradiction between public and private. This unevenness was marked by the movement of these women between two occupational choices that was socially considered to be contradictory. An interesting dichotomy developed at this point, as on one hand, their portrayal of roles such as of gods and goddesses were hugely appreciated, because of the saints, of the characters they played. Hindus worship those same gods and goddesses, but at the same time, behind the proscenium, they were ostracized and directed towards sexual gaze of the Bhadralok society. Binodini, who later became one of the most talented first actresses of the stage, left behind a narrative of this transition process. Her narrative definitely encompassed experiences of persecution and humiliation. Her scathing criticism of men from the highest echelons of Bhadralok society portrays a fluent understanding of the socio-economic powers in operation in the society at that time. Her perceptive analysis in Amar Kotha, her autobiography, also points to the constructed frame of morality by the society used to serve its own purposes. Here, I would like to draw from Mary Renda's response to Anne Stoller's book, Tense and Tender Ties, where tender ties reflect on the humanist intervention of the colonial rule, so to say, the intervention of the intimate spaces by the colonial state, and the tense ties in Foucauldian terms reflect on the production of colonial inequities. Mary Renda, in her comment on this book, reflects that it would be a mistake to read body and sexuality to be either equivalent or coterminous with the intimate. And Stoller, in her other book, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, reflects on how sexuality operates as a dense transfer point in power relations. At the same time, it is essential to acknowledge the broader investigative possibilities of the body or history of intimacy that further has the capacity to yield a nuanced understanding of individual and collective authority. Antoine Burton and Tony Ballantyne, in their very important book, Moving Subjects, completely reject the notion of private and public as segregated spheres. And they are more driven to nominate mobility as a constitutive factor in the social life of sentiment and its multiple articulations. This understanding becomes crucial in identifying the actress-prostitute connexion in Bhadralok society. In articulating the intimate in case of stage actresses, it further enables the intimate powers in the most translocal sense, reflecting on the instability that has historically operated. While arguing for a feminine space in theater, it is essential to focus on the translocality of historical spaces, which is reflected in how a subject gains subjectivity by moving in and through them. This analysis is crucial to understand the position of actresses and the choices at their disposal in the development of the social thought in Calcutta, how they operated within a gendered framework and mandated space that was determined by their creative labor, and to a certain extent tried to overcome the overtly sexualized portrayal of female performers, often intervening with their intimate space. Having given this context that largely reflects on the social thought regarding actresses and female performers, I will now directly go on to the socio-politically charged decades of 30s and 40s to contextualize the actresses who also became conscious political workers during this time. So going on to the second part of my talk. The formation of Progressive Writers Association and the inception of Indian People's Theatres Association during the 1930s and 40s, several historians on this have argued that the early demise of this pan-Indian movement was rendered to the inability to incorporate rapidly changing cultural situation between the 30s and the 50s. One of the primary reasons is that the cultural movement was hinged on the then current cultural issues, and the persistence of the same form has been both an inspiration and an impediment, as pointed out famously by K.N. Panikkar. This situation can be rightly adjusted to the form and content debate in Hayden White's theorization. The primary problem with the progressive cultural movement was that content changed according to the social and political condition. However, the form in terms of the concepts and vocabulary of the movement remained the same. I would like to highlight here a few lines from Munshi Premchand's presidential address, which I reflected on in my first slide. Premchand says, "We believe that the new literature of India must deal with the basic problems of our existence today. The problems of hunger, the problems of poverty, social backwardness, political subjection. All that drags us down to passivity, inaction, and unreason, we reject as reactionary. All that arouses us, the cultural spirit, which examines institutions and customs in the light of reason, which helps us to act, organize ourselves, to transform, we accept as progressive." During the 1930s, intellectuals and eminent scholars started writing for the cause of peace, primarily concentrating on anti-war and anti-fascist literature. Writers like Maxim Gorky, Romain Rolland, André Malraux, Thomas Mann, Waldo Frank, among others, were a part of the World Congress of Writers for Defense of Culture in Paris in 1935. The first manifesto was sponsored by the Indian Progressive Writers Association, was signed by Rabindranath Tagore, Prafulla Chandra Roy, Premato Chaudhary, Ramananda Chatterjee, and Nandalal Bose, among others, and was sent to the peace conference convened by Romain Rolland on 3rd September 1936 in Brussels. It highlighted, "Today, the specter of the world war haunts the world. Fascist dictatorship has revealed its militarist essence by its offer of gun instead of butter, and the lust of empire building in place of cultural opportunities." This is a picture of Sajjad Zahir addressing the Progressive Writers Association in the 1930s. The devastating Bengal famine of 1943 had a lasting impact on content produced by writers and intellectuals during this time in India. Works of art with new content came into the front line that effectively utilized folk forms. For example, Panohali songs of Nibarun Pondit, famine dance of Panu Pal, which was also known as Mahamari Nritya, Gombhira songs of Malda, Kobi Gan of Horipodo Kushari, Nepal Sarkar, Ramesh Seal, a play Main Bhuka Hoon that literally translates to I Am Hungry by Binoy Roy, Jaban Bondi and Nobonno of Bijon Bhattacharya, which became two of the landmark plays of the IPTA. This spurt of new content led to the formation of IPTA in 1943. Saurabh Mohan Mitra writes that after August 1942 resolution of Quit India, when the leaders were put behind bars and the people were groveling in the slush of despair, the Communist Party shouldered the responsibility of organizing masses against Japanese fascism and rehabilitation of famine-stricken people. The IPTA tried to arouse the conscience of community and to make people work for a great humanist endeavor. EMS, this picture is the first manifesto of Progressive Writers Association. EMS Nambudripad, in his review article on Shruti Pradhan's Documents of Marxist Cultural Movement in India, which one of the primary sources for PWA and IPTA, writes that the second conference that was held in Calcutta in the year 1938 made certain amendments to the above mentioned, or to the manifesto you're seeing on screen, which he says, quote unquote, were not of substantial nature. In a fleeting sense, he adds that among the literary trends to be combated, the amendment added the word sexual libertinism. This highlights that even in the light of progressive movement, social and sexual confrontation were not allowed to intersect. This also becomes very crucial when it comes to the question of actresses in the Indian People's Theatre Association in the context of the socio-political climate heightened by war, fascism, and the rift in leftist movement. The experiences of women of the IPTA during these adverse conditions necessitated overcoming of gender and class barriers. The gendered identities were negotiated through performative strategies that in turn redefined a new gender paradigm previously in place for female performers, as I discussed in the first section of my talk. This redefinition marked a rupture from the previous generation of actresses, often treated as low class or fallen women by the virtue of their profession. Anya Lumba, in her book Revolutionary Desires, analyzes radical communist women and notes how the neglect in deciphering the histories of women engaged in active socio-political work itself is striking. Since many of these narratives and autobiographies were only used perfunctorily to gauge the larger socio-political movement and making the source a part of the larger meta-narrative, Tripti Mitro's and Reba Roy's autobiography highlight their voices, moreover, their nuanced experiential history of how their roles shaped the new gender paradigm amidst the tense socio-political climate. Actresses of the IPTA had to spend time in close proximity with their male counterparts, therefore exposing themselves to a new set of gender culture. Within the IPTA, women primarily remained performers, but within the larger socio-political movement of which IPTA was a considerable part of, these women represented active socio-political participation through performance strategies. Going directly to the discussion of Tripti Mitro's and Reba Roy Chaudhury's autobiography. Tripti Mitro in one of her chapters says or tries to gauge where was the beginning of her interest in theatre. So I would like to quote a few lines which I've translated from Bangla when Tripti Mitro says, "I cannot remember when during my childhood I felt an attraction towards theatre. But my first appearance in professional theatre was purely accidental. When I was in Calcutta living with my elder sister and uncle, one day my cousin Bijonda, a famous theatre director Bijon Bhattacharya, decided to write a play on 1940s Bengal famine. People called it man-made famine. In this play, I first participated as a replacement to the female protagonist, as at that time there was a scarcity of female performers. The leading lady had certainly left the group. I never considered acting as a profession. 30, 40 years ago, I did not consider acting as a job. I felt nervous. I never performed with boys and thought it would be my last performance. I had the ambition of either becoming a doctor or a professor or a social activist. By this time, Bengal famine had brought Bengal down to its knees. It had become imperative for Mitra, among thousands of others, to help people in distress, as it was an unprecedented time at the grassroots level. She was already a social worker who conducted relief kitchens. She says it was a time when the specter of death, of seeing dead bodies on roads, haunted us. The two famous plays, Nobonno and Joban Bundi of IPTA, were written and were performed in this context. Tripti Mitro was born in a small block town of North Bengal called Thakurgaon. Her town did not have a high school, but it did have a theatre house named after King George V's coronation. It was called the George Coronation Hall. The hall had separate areas of men and women. Women were subjected to the peripheries of the theatre, even as a spectator. They did not have seats allocated to them and had to carry their own mattresses. One of the other aspects of discouraging women from being a part of the audience were the ticket sales. Mitra points out that the tickets for men were priced at ₹1, whereas for women they were priced at ₹12. She recollects how during her childhood her father disliked her and her mother's theatre visits as quote unquote women, especially girls from respectable families, were not allowed to perform or even be the audience of a theatre play. Mitra fondly remembers how her mother loved watching plays and calls it the very beginning of the beginning. She recollects how IPTA was formed in the context of Second World War and Bengal famine. and underlines how Indian People's Theatre Association was created out of sheer necessity. It was a cultural front of dance, drama, songs, and recitation. Mitra's association with the IPTA lasted till 1948. Primarily working in the Bengal wing, she was a part of path-breaking plays like Jyotirindra Mitro's Navajiboner Gan and Madhubonshir Goli. The play Nabonno, which means new harvest or the new grain, was a landmark and one of the most prominent plays of IPTA. She highlights how the spectators who gathered were deeply imbued in the cultural aspects of the play. IPTA, in a certain sense, as Mitra points out articulated, very importantly, the other theatre, or the people's theatre, breaking away from the bourgeois arrangement of theatre proscenium, what a lot of historians argue was a colonial input. Mitra insists that IPTA's theatrical forays were born out of a social necessity. So one of the prominent plays of IPTA, which was based on Bengal famine, Jabanbandi, was also made into a Hindi movie called Dharti Ke Lal. Tripti Mitra was part of both. She recollects sitting in the residence of the director, Khwaja Ahmed Abbas, and discussing the script. So I'm going to play the introduction of the movie, of course, not the entire movie, for the audience. I hope it is visible. There is no sound because the film has been restored from its original format. So this is the first scene of the film Dharti Ke Lal. So by this time, especially during the time of independence, Mitra did not see acting or participating in theater as a profession, but an act of patriotism. Learning about the economic history regarding black marketing and the Bengal famine, instead a zeal in actors and actresses alike, and stressing on the word alike, to perform. However, the main objective was also to collect funds for the people affected by the famine. The touring group, of which she was a considerable part of, would tour from village to village to collect funds. Mitra says that this time in Calcutta especially was a dangerous time for women, as in those days the roads were not safe. This was a time of blackout in Calcutta. All the lights of the city remained off, especially the street lights. Roads were almost empty, except the occasional noises of military vans and whistles of the American soldiers or the Tommies. At a horrific incident regarding train travel, she says, we were looking for an empty compartment, but wherever we were trying to enter, I found it reserved for army men. Suddenly, we found people running towards an empty compartment. We jumped into the coach, fighting the crowd, and suddenly I found myself on the floor. Someone had put a huge sack on my body. I had no power to shout. Lolita, another female comrade, shouted, "Money will die." Someone lit a candle and helped me out. The feminine space that actresses like Mitro mandated was tainted by patriarchal mores, both inside and outside, leading to the subject gaining subjectivity by moving in and through them. As Mitra quotes, in our society, if a woman does something with her husband, she's great. She's taking care of her husband and is relegated to the domestic cause. I had to work both inside and outside. The dynamic of a group theater also represented this movement, and there was an hierarchy of writer, director, lead actors, and supporting actors. In most of the plays, the writer, director, and the lead actor was a male comrade. Hence, the spaces these actresses mandated was solely based on the fame they garnered through their creative labor and performative strategies. In one of the chapters in Mitra's memoir, she highlights how conventional beauty standards dictated the opportunities for an actress. In one of the famous plays of Rabindranath Tagore, Char Adhyay, 4 chapters, the lead protagonist was a lady of eloquent beauty, as written by Tagore. The character's name was Ella. Mitra says she wanted to put on some makeup for the character, but was taunted by Shambhu Mitra, who was her co-actor, and later on, Tripti Mitra married Shambhu Mitra. Shambhu Mitra wanted her to concentrate on the character solely. During that time, post-place actors used to receive a lot of letters of appreciation or criticism. Mitra specifically points out how some of them wrote that she should not try to do Ella with an ugly face. However, Mitra's acting abilities and labor on stage did garner a lot of attention in a positive way. I would like to play this video, which highlights her performative strategy on stage. You can see her voice modulation, her throw of dialogue, and the power her performance was embodied with.
When I decided that this will be my vocation.
Yeah, so.
হাসি নিয়ে রেখেছে ঝাঁকি আপনার হৃদয়ের তেজ। আরে আরে ভেবে তো বাবার জানো নাকি রিজিয়ার নয়নের কোনো মাত্র জ্যোতি স্পর্শ মাত্রে গতিবারে পারে শত শত বাবার সহজাতি সম্রাট নন্দিনী মৃত্যু হয় দেখাও কাহারে জানো নাকি রাতার বালক মাতৃঅঙ্গ হতে ছুটে চলে যায় সিংহ শিষ্যনে করিবারে মল্লনন তুমি দিল্লেশ্বরী ওটাকে তোমার শত শত তাতাদের হৃদয় শুনিতে বদ্ধভূমি হইবে রঞ্জিত কিন্তু যদি এই রক্ষী চন্দ্রপক্ষে এই দ্বন্দ্বে স্পর্শিত মম দ্বিখণ্ডিত করে তপশীল কি করিতে পারো তুমি কি করিতে পারি আমি আরে আরে বাপু তাতার এই বাম পদাঘাতে ক্ষুদ্র পতঙ্গের মতো তোমারে তুলিতে পারি খবক্তিয়ার বাসনা যদ্যপি দেখো প্রত্যক্ষ প্রমাণ কি করিতে পারি আমি
So in order to analyze one of the incidents that Tripti Mitra talks about in her memoir, I would like to highlight a line from Ellen Diamond's influential essay, where she talks about the Brechtian feminist model that can lead to dismantling the gaze, particularly the male gaze actresses often get subjected to. In the essay, Diamond tries to provide a way out by utilizing Brechtian theory. However, I would like to underline the problematization of body at this point and its corporeal identity formed through the character of an actress. Diamond says, in its conventional iconicity, theater laminates body to character. But the body in historicization stands visibly and palpably separate from the role of the actor as well as the role of the character. The larger argument being that the body of an actor cannot be detached completely from its historicization. Moreover, the historicity of the social context is reflective even when the socio-political contexts change. For example, the actress-prostitute debate. In the case of actresses of the IPTA arguing for a feminine space within the transitioning norms of theater and cultural movement, it does not yield into a claim that the space was feminized in the broadest meaning of the term. I will try to explain this with an example on how the conflation of an actress with a prostitute was steeped in the social thought in Bengal, even at the grassroots level. So one day while rehearsing for a famous play, Jawan Bundi, the group of Tripti Mitra was a part of, she was also collecting funds for the famine-stricken people in Bengal in one of the villages. Due to the scorching heat and the rigorous rehearsing techniques the group practiced on an everyday basis, Mitra ventured out in the village to get some water. 2 or 3 peasant women came out of their huts to help her. The head of the family, who was an adult male, forbade them to give water to the quote-unquote noties, public women. For Tripti Mitra, who was working relentlessly to help the same villagers, it was a moment of utter shame and despair. she categorically points out how things changed after her marriage with Shambhu Mitra. So going to now the autobiography of Reba Roy Chaudhary, Jeebonet Tane, Shilpet Tane, The Pull of Life, The Pull of Art. I would now begin a discussion on her. Roy was born in Rajshahi, but grew up in Rangpur, now in Bangladesh. She says that her mother was, quote unquote, cultured lady, and as a child, she loved to watch plays, especially the ones by Shishir Bhadri. Childhood was hard, with a lot of financial hardships that Roy's family had to face. She constantly drew inspiration from her elder brothers and actively participated in the students' movement during her time at Rangpur College. She says her brothers taught her, quote unquote, communism. She points out how, due to her active participation in politics, she did not receive much affection from other women in her family, as she would often return late at night. Roy became an active member of Women's Self-Defense and also used to read Communist Party's journal, frequently called Saptahik Janayuddha, Weekly People's War. Roy, with her other women comrades, gathered domes and relief by hosting free food stalls, distributing khichuri, rice and lentils, and arranging for medicine. Roy recollects how she was a part of creating women's organization in every block, from Badarhanj to Nilfamri to Kurigram, Gaibandho, Domar, Lalmonihat, and was a considerable part of the radical communist activities. In Badarganj and Rangpur, she was, with other female comrades, would raid the storehouses of middlemen during Bengal famine and would distribute rice amongst the commoners who did not have access. She recollects how in the year 1943, when Kanak Mukherjee reviewed women's movement as a part of Communist Party, Reba Roy received her membership. At that time, she was just 18. This happened right after the legalization of Communist Party of India by the colonial authorities in the year 1942. Coming to one of the most, these are the two pictures of Reba Roy Chaudhary performing during the 1940s. Coming to one of the most important experiences in Reba's life, her imprisonment and her experience of incarceration. So when the Communist Party of India was banned around 1948, thousands of comrades were imprisoned. The IPTA's leadership also went through a massive alteration. The PIT cell was formed that comprised of people like Shaduna Chaudhary, Preeti Banerjee, Jeevan Mukherjee, and Reba Roy Chaudhary. Roy points out how she was a part of the underground communist meetings with the leaders that comprised of the leading men of the party, like Mrinal Sen, Debabruto Biswas, Krishna Banerjee. Debabruto Biswas's house was the makeshift IPTA office during this time. Roy very vividly recollects how on 27th April 1948, police opened fire on all women's rally near Calcutta Medical College. Reba Roy Chaudhary's friends, Latika Sen, Pratibha Ganguly, Amia Dutt, Geeta Sarkar died that day. Reba points out that her only financial help during this time was also on the basis of her creative labor. She used to give dance tuitions and receive rupees 50. In the year 1949, political prisoners went on a hunger strike, and this was going on in Presidency Jail in West Bengal. Roy, with her other comrades, started singing along and raising slogans. She writes, "I suddenly found a pair of headlights advancing towards me. It was a police van. The police could do anything at that time. I jumped into the drain and found myself in dirty water. The police pulled me out by pulling my braid. They beat me mercilessly with their baton. Another female comrade, Jyoti Chakraborty, was beaten so much that her entire face and head were drenched in blood. We suddenly felt courageous and shouted at the police, 'Are you not feeling any shame in beating a woman twice your age?' The police incarcerated Reba and her fellow inmates in a small dingy room at Lal Bazar, Calcutta. They did not provide food and gave dirty blankets to cover their bodies. Days later, they were given few quarters of dried bread and a lamp was lit. The room was filled with bad odor, with a few other girls who did not have any piece of clothing to cover their bodies." Roy compares this description to Tolstoy's description of prison in his book Resurrection. She specifically says that the female actresses and political prisoners had commendable physical strength. all of them used to recite songs from their prison cells at the top of their voices to maintain moral support and derive strength from each other. I'm going to play the song that became really famous during this time. It means Deu uteche kara noche, which literally translates to waves are rising in full furrow, the prison rage. So one of the voices, the female voices in the song is of Reba Roy Chaudhary. After a few days of her prison experience of forced feeding of political prisoners started. Roy points out how women goons were hired to beat the female prisoners and forcefully inject rectum catheter through nose and feed milk. Reba Roy Chaudhary spent around 60 days like this. The day she was released, she had lost about 10 kgs of weight. And the inmates sang in unitone, "Amra to bhuli nei she shohider kotha, shei kotha bhulbo na, tomader kalejar khune rongailoi ontokar jailkhana," which literally translates to that we are not going to forget the word of martyrs, even in the darkness of the prison. So coming to the very last part of my talk, I'll just change the slide. Actresses like Tripti Mitra and Reba Roy embodied, as I said, a new gender culture amidst harsh political climate. And this marked a rupture as they acted in unconventional ways, which broke the previous paradigm of social thought regarding actresses. Participating in the cause for people equally as their masculine counterpart, performing with an equal finesse and socio-politically motivated at an equal level, but unfortunately relegated to the peripheries of larger historical meta-narratives. Compensatory histories regarding women who were a part of socio-political struggles try to highlight how female bodies could represent masculine activism. In case of actresses, a constant comparison with their male counterparts in historical writing leads to a redundant analysis. Similarly, emancipation and carving out of a feminine space cannot be gauged through their ability to perform and conduct their political activities side by side to men. Drawing this parallel is problematic as many of the women like Mitra embodied a subversion of the domestic sphere. The occupational mobility was a constant movement between inside and outside, unlike the male comrades. Actresses of the IPTA also inherited and inhabited the patriarchal structure and conservative public and private divide extolled by upper class men and upper caste men. The kind of feminine space that they became a considerable part of was somewhat between radicalism and conservatism. Their radical lives had in-depth psychological underpinnings of underground life and the life of a nomad artist touring from village to village. It is important to note the underbearings of their heroic sacrifice that these women unevenly embraced. It will be too simplistic to connote their self-expression in their memoirs to be hagiographic. In the light of revolutionary women like Kalpana Dutt and Preetilata Vadedar, memoirs like this of these actresses come political workers have been rendered to the periphery. So thank you so much. With that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, Twisha, for that fascinating presentation. I would now like to invite Professor Shubho Basu to have a conversation with Twisha. And to all the audience members, if you want to start putting in your questions, please do so by using the Q&A box or the chat box.
Thank you, Trisha, for an excellent presentation and a very stimulating presentation too. I have two not so important questions for you. The first thing is that theoretically, when there took place a kind of rupture in patriarchy and rupture in the existing social norms, there may emerge some kind of space for women to come out. Would you say that the Bengal famine and later on the partition of Bengal acted as provided such kind of space to women to come out? I mean, it was a period of crisis within Bengal. And that crisis was reflected in the death of 4.3 million people out of hunger. And then there took place a partition, and that obviously uprooted a significant number of people from both sides of Bengal. And as a consequence, we find that there obviously took place a certain kind of battle within the context of the overall patriarchal norms, and that had its reflections within the world of art, and particularly performing arts. And could you please say that, that was the kind of rupture that we experienced in 1940s? Because in 1930s, that was not so much the case, but in 1943, 44, there took place three different kind of rupture. One was the arrest of the entire Congress leaders because of the Quit India movement, and that created an open space. The second rupture is obviously the Bengal famine, and the third rupture was the vicious communal writings and the partition of Bengal. But that, to a certain extent, also to a certain extent, relaxed the kind of patriarchal control over women's body, relaxed the social norms, and to a certain extent that enabled within a kind of, one would say, reform patriarchy, or one would say it's an oxymoron, a revolutionary patriarchy, a certain kind of agency for women to emerge. That's one question. The second, another thing which I'd just like to point out, that some of these transitions towards the stage acting by women, though on a very limited scale in comparison to Indian People's Theatre Association movement, took place in Shantiniketan. And this was because of the Tagore's dance dramas and Tagore's plays actually enabled women to participate in it. And Tagore himself actually traveled throughout India in order to collect money for Vishwabharati University, with the kind of, particularly with dance drama troupes. So that, to a certain extent, also, to a certain extent, not to a great extent, because there took place a significant degree of controversy surrounding the figure of Tagore about women's participation and legitimize about women's participation in the stage. Those are the two kind of questions I have. I mean, obviously, it would be nicer to look also to the kind of the Tagorean play that Shantiniketan actually presented and played a critical role to a certain extent, I would say, in legitimizing within the kind of the context of the patriarchy of women's participation in the performing arts, particularly in dance, drama, etc. Those are the two questions. And as far as the 19th century was concerned, I mean, obviously there was the kind of connection between the supposed role of the sex workers or prostitutes and the acting on the stage, and to a certain extent it provided freedom to women from a kind of simply being viewed as a sex worker, and provided a creative impulse for them to bring out. But at the same time, we shall find that there is a kind of parallel all over India, which to a certain extent is romanticized by the mainstream media, the figure of the wife and the figure of the, in the context of the North India, the kind of within the dancing girl who used to compose Urdu poems and enact on the stage. And also in Bengal, we find that these Bengali women also acted on the stage. So to a certain extent, it is a kind of late 19th, from the almost from the late 18th century towards the late 19th century, there is a continuum whereby certain groups of women, presumably from working class origin, played a critical role in breaking social norms regarding, and because the social norms actually were, because they had certain kind of agency, and obviously there was a much greater lack of agency in presenting their performance. This is a kind of, there is a kind of dialectical situation here, that because patriarchy marginalizes them, and at the same time patriarchy actually enables them to come forward in the stage and perform. If you could actually tease out these kind of dialectics of the situation embedded within the patriarchy, whereby patriarchy marginalizes their sexual labor, and at the same time, because they were already stigmatized, it enables them a certain kind of freedom from a theoretical perspective. I shall not continue too much because I have enough time to grill you and bore you at McGill, and so I think the audience will ask you questions, and you will participate in the discussion, and that will be a kind of the real kind of where you will find a real discussion in this talk.
Yes, of course. Yes, so Professor Basu, drawing from your first question, of course, it was during the 1930s when the adverse socio-political situation mandated or pushed literally women out to perform, especially the political workers of the IPTA. They were performing for a cause. This was a rupture from the previous generation of actresses who did not have, quote unquote, that cause. They were acting to portray their active vocation, primarily because of the reason that theaters did not have respectable women participating, and financially, to sustain the theater houses, the previous generation, like Binodini Alokeshi, had to act. But 1930s, and especially 40s, it represented a very different situation, socially, politically, and economically. So the actresses, who were also conscious political workers, came to the forefront during this time. However, the argument that you said is very aptly put, that the larger patriarchal context was embedded. That enabled them, but also was an impediment when we draw. So the linkage or the dialectical relationship when we draw between the macro and the micro. At micro level, they were performing in villages, they had their creative labor, they were focusing on their creative labor and performance strategies. But at the macro level, when it comes to the party structure, they were very small, they mandated a very small position. And when it comes to the larger social context, they were even smaller. And I would also try to draw a parallel from the First World War and Second World War situation in Britain, when women joined the workforce, and that was just taken back immediately after the war. So that kind of a change happened when in 40s, due to the social movement, the political movements, and independence mandated these actresses coming from respectable families and joining the performers. But there was a slight drawback after the 40s, after Indian independence. And that's why I also stated in the first half of my talk why the pan-Indian cultural movement fizzled out in 47 and 48. So I think I would open now the stage for audience's questions. Dr. Basu, if you have questions from the audience, please.
Yes, Twisha, we already have 2 questions. And before that, thank you to Professor Basu for those very insightful comments. I am sure Twisha will have time to reflect on them later or during the Q&A session. So the first question is from Sabina Sheikh. Twisha, thanks for a great talk. I enjoyed it very much. I have a question. How contested was the feminine space for the actresses who were also political workers?
Yes, as I said, the space that they mandated as female actresses was highly imbued in the patriarchal mores. So they embraced the performative strategies, their active participation unevenly as compared to their male counterparts. So it was highly contested, even when I quote the example when Tripti Mitra goes to the village just to ask for water, and she is helping those villages, procuring money, funds, and helping them to provide food and medicine, but she was basically categorized as a public woman or a noti. Noti literally translates to whore. So it was a highly contested space. And the patriarchal mores were invisibilized in the actresses to a very large extent. They inherited that, they embodied that. So I am arguing for a feminine space from the historian's perspective, but Tripti Mitra and Reba Roy Chaudhary are not doing that in their autobiographies. So thank you, Sabina, for that very insightful question. And I think I'll take the next question now.
Yeah, the next question is from Shoradeep Roy. Should we revise the current historiography that seems to think that the pre-IPTA generation of actresses were somehow not political? Perhaps they presented a different kind of politics and political consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very, very interesting question and a very helpful insight to my research. Yes, they represented a different type of socio-political scenario, the generation previous to IPTA. They have not been part of political movements, but they mandated a space in the performative area, surely on the basis of their performative strategies and creative labor. They have been gendered to the peripheries by being said that they were prostitutes coming from red light areas. Both Binodini, Golab Shundari, Shukumari Dotto even started the Hindu all-women's female theatre, which very soon after got dismantled because of the constant criticism. So they were trying to participate, but at that time they were brought down massively in the public debates and discussions and in the social platform. Shukumari Dotto, even she got married before participating and performing on stage, and her husband abandoned her after a few years, and she had a very young daughter. So that primarily suggests how the sexual identity of the prostitute was tethered to that of the personality of the actress. And there was no detachment of that while viewing or gauging or analyzing the creative labor of the actress. So thank you, Shoradeep, for that question.
We have to wait for more questions. I think people are thinking after your, fascinating presentation. I had a couple of questions about,
yes.
The conceptualization of work in terms of performance. So here we are looking at actresses and their work on stage. But I was wondering if you are looking at the relationships between the performing women as performers, but also a large number of women who are coming out and they are emerging as working women, especially in terms of their work with the influx of refugees coming in, the cross-border influx. So how do you situate performance and work vis-a-vis that relationship? And my second question is about the historiography of IPTA itself. There is a tendency to focus on exemplary figures, and figures like Tripti Mitra, Shambhu Mitra, and others, they are well known. What about, folk performers? You've mentioned a few during your talk. Have you come across any folk women performers and the exchange? Have you come across it or anything like this in the archives, the exchange between these actresses and, these indigenous performers? And is there any kind of dialogue which then goes on to shape the performances that they're performing in?
Yes, Dr. Basu, can you just repeat your first question? The voice cracked due to some technical glitch.
Okay, yes. So I was, my question was about the conceptualization of work, performance as work. Yes. You are focusing on actresses, but the time period you're looking at, 1940 to 60, I'm also thinking about a large number of women who are working with refugees, and they're also, coming out and as working women. So the nexus or the kind of relationship between performance as work and the work that women are doing in these sectors. I mean, I think there was some recent publication by Maithili Srinivas and Uditi Sen, who are doing this work with, the first generation of feminists in India and working women. So if you could reflect a little bit on that.
So my entire, the larger goal of my dissertation and thesis is what you just said. It's to basically amalgamate these performers on the basis of their creative identity with the larger workforce, and to argue that their creative labor was actually it had a tangible and corporeal identity, and it should be measured vis-a-vis the working women, the labor of working women, and not be rendered to the periphery just because it includes performance, dance, drama. So that is one of the foremost aims of my research. And especially while talking about Reba Roy and Shripti Mitro, I try to focus on their activities as part of the Communist Party of India, also at par with the men. Even the comparison which I say in my concluding slide, that they have been compared to men time and again on the basis of their physical abilities or performance strategies, is itself flawed. That's what the second generation of feminists also argue, to not compare to the masculine counterpart, but to highlight their labor in their own terms, in the terms of their performance and their identities on stage. Coming to the second part of your question, yes, I have read about a lot of folk culture and folk forms. Unfortunately, my area of my research is theatre, mostly the bourgeois, which we call the colonial input when I research on modern British theatre. And in India, it's especially people's theatre with an arrangement of theatrical space of stage. So I don't delve that much deeper into folk forms. But while doing my research in the British Library, I did not come across a lot of female performers. The examples I quote were also of male folk theatre artists. So unfortunately, I don't have much expertise to comment on that. But thank you for both the insightful questions, Dr. Priyanka Basu.
Thank you, Trisha. Your fourth question is from Maria Tumioto. Thanks, Trisha, for this talk, rich with fascinating threads. I found really interesting your claim that women actresses, though were political workers, appeared cast in the background by narrations, memoirs, works on, and by revolutionary women like Kalpana Dutt. When addressed memoirs by actresses, did you use particular theoretical tools to analyze their subalternity, both as women and in comparison to more famous female activists?
Yes, thank you so much for that very important question. Theatrically, while talking about performance strategies that these women embodied, there was definitely a disjunct between their male counterparts and the kind of performance strategies they portrayed on stage. For example, when I talk about the letter of criticism, when Shripti Mitro is portraying the role of Ella and she's called ugly, that wouldn't have been true for a male actor. It's only like you're commenting on someone's beauty. So obviously the performative strategy was underplayed in that, when the entire focus is on the male gaze, on the sexual gaze. So when I talk about Diamond's essay, I talk about dismantling of this gaze, and the actress's body is strongly tethered to this historicity of the actress-prostitute connection. So of course, I'm looking at a lot of theatrical and performative strategies while drawing that claim. I hope I have answered your question, and it was a very interesting question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trisha. I think we need to again wait for more questions. But I also wanted to ask you a very basic question about, how are you conceptualizing performative or cultural labor in your work by looking at the actresses? I know there exists, studies like Brahm Prakash's cultural labor in terms of folk forms. and something specifically on IPTA actors, actresses and women performers by Urmimala Sarkar and Vishnupriya Dutt. So where are you situating your work in comparison to these existing literature, and how are you thinking of cultural labor in this?
Yes, so basically, thank you again for that question, because I draw heavily from all these historians, because they have worked on that. Very few historians have worked on performance strategies. So basically what I argue as creative labor is the skill that they displayed on stage, the skill that was their performative strategy. For example, when I showed Tripti Mitro's monologue, if you see her voice modulations, if you see the dialogue delivery, which is very powerful and which has not been discussed or debated or analyzed to a certain extent. People have analyzed plays, people have analyzed the director's perspective. Historians have talked about Bijon Bhattacharya's play, Jyotirindra Mitro's play, but no one talks about the skill these actresses put on a day-to-day basis. For example, even there's one example when I quote that Tripti Mitro rehearses every day from morning to night in basically establishing that finesse on stage. Which is a part of a performative strategy. So that is what I conceptualize as creative labor, as a part of the corporeal identity of the actor on stage. And that's how I'm trying to fit into the larger argument of labor, the kind of labor they portrayed on stage on the basis of these skills, which have been marginalized, which I like to enmesh with the larger meta-narratives.
Thank you, Twisha. I think we are still waiting for more questions, but if you would want to reflect or say something as a response to Professor Basu's questions, you can do that.
Professor Basu, do you have any other comment on communist workers, women workers in Bangladesh? And that
the thing is this, I was thinking about Dr. Basu's question, Priyanka Basu's question. I think that when we conceptualize about the work, it is obviously that took place a radical transformation in the world of the middle class women and lower middle class women in the context of the famine and the partition and their coming into the labor market, and how that actually corresponds to the kind of theatrical perspective. The basic thing is this, that working class women always work, and they work in the public places. Even the women, peasant women work in the fields, etc., etc. And also, to a certain extent, whenever women came into the urban workspace, particularly Shomita Sen's book establishes that jute mill workers were actually categorized as prostitutes because they were working in the mills, and thus they were outside their rural traditional kind of within traditional workplace in the agriculture, etc. That is one thing that the kind of we are, when we are talking about the women's participation, there is obviously a class dimension in the labor market. There is a class dimension to it. Second thing is this, that when we discuss about women's participation in the workplace, there are obviously two movies that we can refer to. One is obviously Ritik Ghatak's movie Meghe Dhaka Tara, and the second Satyajit Ray's movie Mahanagar. Both actually looks at and problematizes and engages with the idea of women participating in the workplace in late 1950s and 1960s in the context of partition and the refugee women, etc. That to a certain extent transformed kind of participation of women, middle-class women in the workplace. And that had its reflection within the films and theaters and in the world of acting, and to a certain extent acting became a career, but also within the context of, one would say, I don't know whether one would say the reform patriarchy or patriarchy in a different mold, whereby it was recognized and at the same time it was marginalized. Women's work to a certain extent recognized and marginalized. As far as the communist movement is concerned, there is one important observation you have to make is this, that these women mainly were coming from the Hindu middle class family in the context of largely Muslim society in North Bengal, in Dinajpur and Rangpur, which were centers of the Tebhaga movement in 1940.
Yes, yes.
And all of them, Tipti Mitra's Thakurga was actually in Dinajpur, and Dinajpur was a center of where Thakurga was the most important center of the Tebhaga uprising, Dinajpur and to some extent Rangpur too. So as a consequence, you'll find that this was the time period when the Hindu middle class who were landless to a certain extent, or divorced from the connection of the land, only that segment of the Hindu middle class became involved in the communist politics in a situation of intense peasant struggle. And that had its reflection in the kind of political play and in the emergence of the political play. That's the kind of observation that I just offered to you, where you can question it, or that's the kind of the connection between the communist politics and the emergence of the IPTA, particularly the participation by these two very well-known female figures that you have referred to. I mean,
yes. In fact, Reba Roy talks about this political climate, the naval mutiny, the release of prisoners from Azad Hind, the Red Fort trials, and the Tebhaga movement. And the touring group, of which Reba Roy Chaudhary was a part of, would tour from Borishal to Jalpaiguri to Damohanj to Chattogram amidst these contexts. So there is a considerable mention of Tebhaga movement by both Chaudhary and Mitro, which also hints at the kind of political climate that they were a part of. So, Dr. Priyanka Basu, do we have any other questions from the audience members?
Not yet, but I was actually thinking of some recent work.
Yes.
One you might have heard as part of our series, which was by Urvi Khaitan. And she is looking at coal miners during the Second World War, especially the case of women who are also engaged in sex work. So, which corresponds very well with what Professor Basu was speaking about right now. And also, in terms of looking at the ideology of IPTA and performers adhering to it, and I'm thinking of Sanjukta Sundaresan's recent book, Partisan Aesthetics. So there were a lot of artists and performers who were part of the IPTA, but not necessarily following the ideology which we understand when we talk about IPTA. So do these reflections or do these, different threads come across when you look at the autobiographies and remarks?
Yes, of course. When I'm talking about Reba Roy and Tripti Mitro, they were not by themselves. They had an entire entourage of female performers and female helpers who used to help to set the stage for the costumes, for the performance. So the labor in terms, I am drawing on the base of performance, but creating the other theater or the theater for the masses involved a lot of workforce who were trying to basically spread that from village to village without any financial remuneration. So their labor totally went unaccounted for. And these also had female participants who were a part of the rallies, who were a part of the protests, who were incarcerated, who probably died in the police open firing, but their histories have been marginalized because they were basically helping the stage, they were helping with the costumes. Probably there were a lot of background singers. For example, this song I played, Dheu Che Kara Tuche, there are a lot of background singers also. female background singers who were a part of this. So absolutely, their histories have been marginalized, and I did come across a lot of them in pictures. I don't come across their memoirs or autobiographies, but obviously there are a lot of articles they have been referred to, or there are a lot of pictures there are just names of these female participants, but nothing more than the names.
Thank you, Twisha. I don't think there are any more questions, but if you would like to have, if you would like to say something else which you have not covered in your presentation, but you think, you wanted to share, please.
Yeah, I think I have covered, this is like a part of my larger research on actresses and their creative labor. I just wanted to say how the Indian People's Theatre Association was also an anomaly, because it represented the idea of people's theatre, which I have not stressed much in my presentation. The idea of people's theatre was a midway between the bourgeois arrangement of theatre, the stage, the proscenium, the curtains, and the folk forms. So this is one thing which assumed a lot of importance while we talk about the sexual identity, the performative strategies of actresses. The makeshift, the theatrical mappings, the makeshift stage, the stage was no more at one place. It was a moving stage from village to village. It is much different from Jatra or the folk forms, which is also an open stage. It had characteristics of the proscenium, but it was for the people. For example, in Badul Sarkar tries to define this idea of the third theatre, drawing from Augusto Boal's conception of the poor theatre, which becomes very intrinsic in analyzing the socio-economic status of the actresses and the participants who were imbued into labor during the movement, the larger political movement that IPTA was a part of. So that's the only thing that I would like to stress other than this. And thank you so much, Dr. Priyanka Basu, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much, Dr. Shubha Basu, for listening to me patiently and giving your valuable feedback. I will be troubling you after this more often. And thank you so much to the British Library South Asia series for giving me this platform.
Thank you so much, Twisha. And thank you, Professor Basu, for joining us today, for taking our time out for us today. And Twisha, good luck on your doctoral dissertation, which I'm sure will make a fantastic monograph eventually. Thank you to our audience members who joined us tonight. A lot of you have joined in from India, so thank you for staying up late. Our next talk is on the 16th of August. Dr. Afsar Muhammad from University of Pennsylvania will be speaking to us on No Longer a Nawab, the making of a new Hyderabadi Muslim. So do join us on 16th August, same time, 5:30 p.m. And thank you, stay safe and stay well. Thank you once again.